The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness by Erich Fromm. Introduction. Instincts and Human Passions. The increase in violence and destructiveness on a national and world scale has turned the attention of professionals and the general public alike to the theoretical inquiry into the nature and causes of aggression. Such a concern is not surprising. What is surprising is the fact that this preoccupation is so recent, especially since an investigator of the towering stature of Freud, revisiting his earlier theory centered around the sexual drive, had already in the 1920s formulated a new theory in which the passion to destroy, death instinct, was considered equal in strength to the passion to love, life instinct, sexuality. The public, however, continued to think of Freudianism chiefly in terms of presenting the libido as man's central passion, checked only by the instinct for self-preservation. This situation changed only in the middle of the 60s. One probable reason for this change was the fact that the level of violence and the fear of war had passed a certain threshold throughout the world. But a contributing factor was the publication of several books dealing with human aggression, particularly On Aggression by Konrad Lorenz, 1966. Lorenz, a prominent scholar in the field of animal behavior, and particularly that of fishes and birds, decided to venture out into a field in which he had little experience or competence, that of human behavior. Although rejected by most psychologists and neuroscientists, On Aggression became a bestseller and made a deep impression on the minds of a vast sector of the educated community, many of whom accepted Lorenz's views as the final answer to the problem. The popular success of Lorenz's ideas was greatly enhanced by the earlier work of an author of a very different type, Robert Ardrey, African Genesis, 1961, and The Territorial Imperative, 1967. Not a scientist, but a gifted playwright, Ardrey wove together many data about man's beginnings into an eloquent though very biased brief that was to prove man's innate aggressiveness. These books were followed by those of other students of animal behavior, such as The Naked Ape, 1967, by Desmond Morris, and On Love and Hate, 1972, by Lorenz's disciple, Eibel Eberfeld. All of these works contain basically the same thesis. Man's aggressive behavior, as manifested in war, crime, personal quarrels, and all kinds of destructive and sadistic behavior, is due to a phylogenetically programmed innate instinct, which seeks for discharge and waits for the proper occasion to be expressed. Perhaps Lorenz's neo-instinctivism was so successful not because his arguments are so strong, but because people are so susceptible to them. What could be more welcome to people who are frightened and feel impotent to change the course leading to destruction than a theory that assures us that violence stems from our animal nature, from an ungovernable drive for aggression, and that the best we can do, as Lorenz asserts, is to understand the law of evolution that accounts for the power of this drive. This theory of an innate aggressiveness easily becomes an ideology that helps to soothe the fear of what is about to happen and to rationalize the sense of impotence. There are other reasons to prefer this simplistic answer of an instinctivist theory to the serious study of the causes of destructiveness. The latter calls for the questioning of the basic premises of current ideology. We are led to analyze the irrationality of our social system and to violate taboos hiding behind dignified words, such as defense, honor, and patriotism. Nothing short of an analysis in depth our social system can disclose the reasons for the increase in destructiveness, or suggest ways and means of reducing it. The instinctivistic theory offers to relieve us of the hard task of making such an analysis. It implies that even if we all must perish, we can at least do so with the conviction that our nature forced this fate upon us, and that we understand why everything had to happen as it did. Given the present alignment in psychological thought, criticism of Lorenz's theory on human aggression is expected to fit into other into the other and dominant theory in psychology, that of behaviorism. In contrast to instinctivism, behaviorist theory does not interest itself in the subjective forces which drive man to behave in a certain way. It is not concerned with what he feels, but only in the way he behaves, and in the social conditioning that shapes his behavior. It was only in the 20s that the focus in psychology shifted radically from feeling to behavior, with emotions and passions thereafter removed from many psychologists' field of vision as irrelevant data, at least from a scientific standpoint. The subject matter of the dominant school in psychology became behavior, not the behaving man. The science of the psyche was transformed into the science of the engineering of animal and human conduct. This development has reached its peak in Skinner's neo-behaviorism, which is today the most widely accepted psychological theory in the universities of the United States. The reason for this transformation of psychology is easy to find. The student of man is, more than any other scientist, influenced by the atmosphere of his society. This is so because not only are his ways of thinking, his interests, the questions he raises, all partly socially determined as in the natural sciences, but in his case the subject matter itself, man, is thus determined. Whenever a psychologist speaks of man, his model is that of the men around him, and most of all, himself. In contemporary industrial society, men are cerebrally oriented, feel little, and consider emotions a useless ballast, those of the psychologists as well as those of their subjects. The behavioristic theory seems to fit them well. The present alternative between instinctivism and behaviorism is not favorable to theoretical progress. Both positions are mono-explanatory, depending on dogmatic preconceptions, and investigators are required to fit data in one or the other explanation. But are we really confronted with the alternative of accepting either the instinctivist or the behaviorist theory? Are we forced to choose between Lorenz and Skinner? Are there no other options? This book affirms that there is another option, and examines the question of what it is. We must distinguish in man two entirely different kinds of aggression. The first, which he shares with all animals, is a phylogenetically programmed impulse to attack or to flee when vital interests are threatened. This defensive, benign aggression is in the service of the survival of the individual and the species, is biologically adaptive, and ceases when the threat has ceased to exist. The other type, malignant aggression, i.e. cruelty and destructiveness, is specific to the human species, and virtually absent in most mammals. It is not phylogenetically programmed and not biologically adaptive. It has no purpose, and its satisfaction is lustful. Most previous discussion of the subject has been vitiated by the failure to distinguish between these two kinds of aggression, each of which has different sources and different qualities. Defensive aggression is indeed part of human nature, even though not an innate instinct as it used to be classified. Insofar as Lorenz speaks of aggression as defense, he is right in his assumptions about the aggressive instinct, even though the theory regarding its spontaneity and self-renewing quality is scientifically untenable. But Lorenz goes further. By a number of ingenious constructions, he considers all human aggression, including the passion to kill and to torture, as being an outcome of biologically given aggression, transformed from a beneficial to destructive force because of a number of factors. However, so many empirical data speak against this hypothesis as to make it virtually untenable. The study of animals shows that mammals, and especially the primates, although possessing a good deal of defensive aggression, are not killers and torturers. Paleontology, anthropology, and history offer ample evidence against the instinctivistic thesis. 1. Human groups differ so fundamentally in the respective degree of destructiveness that the facts could hardly be explained by the assumption that destructiveness and cruelty are innate. 2. Various degrees of destructiveness can be correlated to other psychical factors and to differences in respective social structures. And 3, the degree of destructiveness increases with the increased development of civilization, rather than the opposite. Indeed, the picture of innate destructiveness fits history much better than prehistory. If man were endowed only with the biologically adaptive aggression that he shares with his animal ancestors, he would be a relatively peaceful being. If chimpanzees had psychologists, the latter would hardly consider aggression a disturbing problem about which they should write books. However, man differs from the animal by the fact that he is a killer. He is the only primate that kills and tortures members of his own species without any reason, either biological or economic, and who feels satisfaction in doing so. It is this biologically non-adaptive and non-phylogenetically programmed malignant aggression that constitutes the real problem and the danger to man's existence as a species, and it is the main aim of this book to analyze the nature and the conditions of this destructive aggression. The distinction between benign defensive and malignant destructive aggression calls for further and more fundamental distinction, that between instinct and character, or more precisely, between drives rooted in man's physiological needs, organic drives, and those specifically human passions rooted in his character, character-rooted, or human passions. The distinction between instinct and character will be further discussed at great length in the text. I shall try to show that character is man's second nature, the substitute for his poorly developed instincts. Furthermore, that the human passions, such as striving for love, tenderness, freedom, as well as the lust for destruction, sadism, masochism, the craving for power and property, are answers to existential needs, which in turn are rooted in the very conditions of human existence. To put it briefly, instincts are answers to man's physiological needs. Man's character-conditioned passions are the answers to his existential needs, and they are specifically human. While these existential needs are the same for all men, men differ among themselves with regard to their dominant passions. To give an example, man can be driven by love or by the passion to destroy. In each case, he satisfies one of his existential needs, the need to affect or to move something, to make a dent. Whether man's dominant passion is love or whether it is destructiveness depends largely on social circumstances. These circumstances, however, operate in reference to man's biologically given existential situation and the needs springing from it, and not to be an infinitely malleable, undifferentiated psyche, as environmentalist theory assumes. When we want to know, however, what the conditions of human existence are, we are led to further questions. What is man's nature? What is it by virtue of which he is a man? Needless to say, the present climate in social sciences is not very hospitable to the discussion of such problems. They are generally considered the subject matter of philosophy and religion. In terms of positivistic thinking, they are treated as purely subjective speculations without any claim to objective validity. Since it would be inopportune to anticipate at this point the complex argument on the data offered later, I shall content myself now with only a few remarks. In our attempt to define the essence of man, we are not referring to an abstraction arrived at by way of metaphysical speculations like that of Heidegger and Sartre. We refer to the real conditions of existence common to man qua man, so that the essence of each individual is identical with the existence of the species. We arrive at this concept by empirical analysis of the anatomical and neurophysiological structure and its psychical correlations which characterize the species Homo. We thus shift the principle of explanation of human passions from Freud's physiological to a sociobiological and historical principle. Since the species Homo sapiens can be defined in anatomical, neurological, and physiological terms, we should also be able to define him as a species in psychical terms. The point of view from which these problems will be treated here may be called existentialist, albeit not in the sense of existentialist philosophy. This theoretical basis opens up the possibility for a detailed discussion of the various forms of character-rooted malignant aggression, especially of sadism, the passion for unrestricted power over another sentient being, and of necrophilia, the passion to destroy life and the attraction to all that is dead, decaying, and purely mechanical. The understanding of these character structures will, I hope, be facilitated by the analysis of the character of a number of well-known sadists and destroyers of the recent past: Stalin, Himmler, Hitler. Having traced the steps this study will follow, it may be useful to indicate, if only briefly, some of the general premises and conclusions the reader will find in the following chapters. 1. We will not be concerned with behavior separated from the behaving man. We shall deal with the human drives, regardless of whether or not they are expressed in immediately observable behavior. This means, with regard to the phenomenon of aggression, we will study the origin and intensity of aggressive impulses, and not aggressive behavior independent from its motivation. 2. These impulses can be conscious, but more often they are unconscious. 3. They are, most of the time, integrated in relatively stable character structure. 4. In a more general formulation, this study is based on the theory of psychoanalysis. From this follows that the method we will use is the psychoanalytic method of discovering the unconscious inner reality through interpretation of the observable and seemingly insignificant data. The term psychoanalysis, however, is not used in reference to the classic theory, but to a certain revision of it. Key aspects of this revision will be discussed later. At this point, I should like to say only that it is not a psychoanalysis based on the libido theory, thereby avoiding the instinctivistic concepts that are generally assumed to be the very essence of Freud's theory. This identification of Freudian theory with instinctivism, however, is very much open to doubt. Freud was actually the first modern psychologist who, in contrast to the dominant trend, investigated the realm of human passions: love, hate, ambition, greed, jealousy, envy, passions which had previously been dealt with only by dramatists and novelists, became, through Freud, the subject matter of scientific exploration. This may explain why his work found a much warmer and more understanding reception among artists than among psychiatrists and psychologists, at least up to the time when his method became the instrument to satisfy an increasing demand for psychotherapy. Here, the artists felt, was the first scientist who dealt with their own subject matter, man's soul, in its most secret and subtle manifestations. Surrealism showed this impact of Freud on artistic thinking most clearly. In contrast to older art forms, it dismissed reality as irrelevant and was not concerned with behavior. All that mattered was the subjective experience. It was only logical that Freud's interpretation of dreams should become one of the most important influences for its development. Freud could not but conceive his new findings in the concepts and terminology of his own time. Never having freed himself from the materialism of his teachers, he had, as it were, to find a way to disguise human passions, presenting them as outcomes of an instinct. He did this brilliantly by a theoretical tour de force. He enlarged the concept of sexuality, libido, to such an extent that all human passions, aside from self-preservation, could be understood as the outcome of one instinct. Love, hate, greed, vanity, ambition, avarice, jealousy, cruelty, tenderness, all were forced into the straitjacket of this scheme, and dealt with theoretically as sublimations of, or reaction formations against, the various manifestations of narcissistic, oral, anal, and genital libido. In the second period of his work, however, Freud tried to break out of this scheme by presenting a new theory, which was a decisive step forward in the understanding of destructiveness. He recognized that life is not ruled by two egotistic drives, one for food, the other for sex, but by two passions, love and destruction, that do not serve physiological survival in the same way that hunger and sexuality do. Still bound by his theoretical premises, however, he called them life instinct and death instinct, and thereby gave human destructiveness its importance as one of two fundamental passions in a man. This study frees such passions as the strivings to love, to be free, as well as the drive to destroy, to torture, to control, and to submit, from their forced marriage to instincts. Instincts are a purely natural category, while the character-rooted passions are a sociobiological, historical category. Although not directly serving physical survival, they are as strong, and often even stronger, than instincts. They form the basis for man's interest in life, his enthusiasm, his excitement. They are the stuff from which not only his dreams are made, but art, religion, myth, drama, all that makes life worth living. Man cannot live as nothing but an object, as dice thrown out of a cup. He suffers severely when he is reduced to the level of a feeding or propagating machine, even if he has all the security he wants. Man seeks for drama and excitement. When he cannot get satisfaction on a higher level, he creates for himself the drama of destruction. The contemporary climate of thought encourages the axiom that a motive can be intense only when it serves an organic need, i.e., that only instincts have intense motivating power. If one discards this mechanistic, reductionist viewpoint and starts from a holistic premise, one begins to realize that man's passions must be seen in terms of their function for the life process of the whole organism. Their intensity is not due to specific physiological needs, but to the need of the whole organism to survive, to grow both psychically and mentally. These passions do not become powerful only after the physiological needs have been satisfied. They are at the very root of human existence, and not a kind of luxury which we can afford after the normal lower needs have been satisfied. People have committed suicide because of their failure to realize their passions for love, power, fame, revenge. Cases of suicide because of a lack of sexual satisfaction are virtually non-existent. These non-instinctual passions excite man, fire him on, make life worth living. As von Holbach, the philosopher of the French Enlightenment, once said, "A man without passions or desires would cease to be a man." They are so intense precisely because man would not be man without them. The human passions transform man from a mere thing into a hero, into a being that, in spite of tremendous handicaps, tries to make sense of life. He wants to be his own creator, to transform his state of being unfinished into one with some goal and some purpose, allowing him to achieve some degree of integration. Man's passions are not banal psychological complexes that can be adequately explained as caused by childhood traumata. They can be understood only if one goes beyond the realm of reductionist psychology and recognizes them for what they are: man's attempt to make sense out of life and to experience the optimum of intensity and strength he can, or believe he can, achieve under the given circumstances. They are his religion, his cult, his ritual, by which he has to hide even from himself insofar as they are disapproved of by his group. To be sure, by bribery and blackmail, i.e. by skillful conditioning, he can be persuaded to relinquish his religion and to be converted to the general cult of the no-self, the automaton. But this psychic cure deprives him of the best he has, of being a man and not a thing. The truth is that all human passions, both the good and the evil, can be understood only as a person's attempt to make sense of his life, and to transcend banal, merely life-sustaining existence. Change of personality is possible only if he is able to convert himself to a new way of making sense of life, by mobilizing his life-furthering passions and thus experiencing a superior sense of vitality and integration to the one he had before. Unless this happens, he can be domesticated, but he cannot be cured. But even though the life-furthering passions are conducive to a greater sense of strength, joy, integration, and vitality than destructiveness and cruelty, the latter are as much an answer to the problem of human existence as the former. Even the most sadistic and destructive man is human as the saint. He can be called a warped and sick man who has failed to achieve a better answer to the challenge of having been born human, and this is true. He can also be called a man who took the wrong way in search of his salvation. These considerations by no means imply, however, that destructiveness and cruelty are not vicious. They only imply that vice is human. They are indeed destructive of life, of body and spirit, destructive not only of the victim, but of the destroyer himself. They constitute a paradox. They express life turning against itself in the striving to make sense of it. They are the only true perversion. Understanding them does not mean condoning them, but unless we understand them, we have no way to recognize how they may be reduced, and what factors tend to increase them. Such understanding is of particular importance today, when sensitivity towards destructiveness, cruelty is rapidly diminishing, and necrophilia, the attraction to what is dead, decaying, lifeless, and purely mechanical, is increasing throughout our cybernetic industrial society. The spirit of necrophilia was expressed first in literary form by F.T. Marinetti in his Futurist Manifesto of 1909. The same tendency can be seen in much of the art and literature of the last decades that exhibits a particular fascination which all that is decayed, unalive, destructive, and mechanical. The Falangist motto, "Long live death," threatens to become the secret principle of a society in which the conquest of nature by the machine constitutes the very meaning of progress, and where the living person becomes an appendix to the machine. This study tries to clarify the nature of this necrophilious passion, and the social conditions that tend to foster it. The conclusion will be that help in any broad sense can come only through radical changes in our social and political structure that would reinstate man to his supreme role in society. The call for law and order, rather than for life and structure, and for stricter punishment of criminals, as well as the obsession with violence and destruction among some revolutionaries, are only further instances of the powerful attraction of necrophilia in the contemporary world. We need to create the conditions that would make the growth of man, this unfinished and uncompleted being, unique in nature, the supreme goal of all social arrangements. Genuine freedom and independence and the end of all forms of exploitative control are the conditions for mobilizing the love of life, which is the only force that can defeat the love for the dead.